All right, let's get started. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the MIT Mobility Forum. Today, we'll talk about the innovation in school transportation. We have Duncan and Joanna giving us their experience on supporting and innovating in this space. And John Monzati design and will host today's session. And today is the last session of this season. So I would like to do a quick recap of all the topics that we have covered. So I'll go backward. Today is the school translation. And the last time we had two of our senior fellows, Adam Grosser and Jamie Tesla, talk about their report on their 1 year research, as well as the winner of the Rose Best Dissertation Award. The one before we had David Zipper, Stephanie Pollock, and Carol Cockman talk about their report. And then we had a couple of sessions on autonomous vehicle, and this is intentional. We have a higher than typical concentration on autonomous vehicle because the really at scale deployment and imminent expansion in many of the US and global cities. So this one is Drago from Waymo as the head of AI Foundation, talk about the AI technology. We have one set of speakers from the tier 1 and tier 2 suppliers, talk about ADAS and autonomous vehicle driving technology. And we also have other topics on walk and cycling. That's a key aspect we're promoting because often being less emphasized in many of the discussions. We have Professor Adam from UCLA talk about how to look at example beyond Copenhagen for global access. We have a collaboration between MIT and Gensler on looking at the carbon impact of workday, combining both the commuting side of the carbon emission as well as the home and office side, right? We have Professor Missy Cummings talk about the challenges in the safety concerns in autonomous vehicle. We have Julie Kirschbaum and Tom McComb, the leaders from SFMTA and CT, talk about the state of public transit. We have three city leaders, Tilly, Stephanie, and Rachel, talk about the AV adoption, the experience on the ground in different cities. Myself, Cara, and Robin talk about how to prepare city to be better prepared for autonomous vehicle. We have Larry Burns, a veteran in the industry innovation, talk about what's he thinking about the future of learning, living, and the future of access. We have the second session in this term with a car enthusiast, talk about being a car enthusiast does not have to contradict to be a climate change supporter and help promote sustainability. And we started this season with a discussion on street safety, really look at the street design, the engineering and safety connection by Charles, Wes, and Leah. Hope this is a variety of a topic that help you in certain ways. And we'll welcome the audience to give us suggestions for the future sessions starting from February 2026. Any speakers or topic that you recommend that we should cover, please do let us know. Okay, without further ado, let me pass the forum to John.
Super. Okay, thanks, Jinhua. So over 50 million elementary, middle, and high school students travel to and from school on a typical day in the United States. And according to the US DOT, more than half of these students live over 2 miles from school. And of those, roughly half of them take a school bus and about half are driven to school. Now, for those who live under 2 miles from school, of course, walking and cycling are constitute a greater mode share. But we should point out that that share of young children aged 5 to 14 who walk to school has dropped from roughly half in 1970 to less than 10% today. So this session is really about understanding some of the innovations and developments in school transportation. And we are really pleased to have Joanna and Duncan, two entrepreneurs who are truly innovating in this space. I think you all know that the mission of the MIT Mobility Initiative is to nudge us toward a global transportation system that is safe, clean, and inclusive. And Joanna and Duncan are very much working on elements of that mission. So we'll hear from each of them in turn. I want to start with Joanna. So Joanna McFarland is the co-founder and CEO of a company called HopSkipDrive, which is a B2B technology company driving the $30 billion school transportation industry into the future, and solving one of the most pressing challenges facing kids, families, schools, and communities in America. So Joanna's going to tell us a lot more about HopSkipDrive. But just by way of background, before she co-founded HopSkipDrive in 2014, Joanna spent over 15 years of her career in product management, investment banking, and private equity, building and scaling businesses for top technology brands like the Wedding Channel, Green Dot, and YP.com. Joanna holds a BS from the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania and an MBA from Stanford University. She serves on a number of boards and lives in Los Angeles with her husband and her two boys and her favorite, the dog who's lurking in the background. So, Joanna, thanks for joining us today. I want to just start out before we get into any slides or anything like that. Could you just tell us what was your motivation to found this company, HopSkipDrive?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you so much for having me today. I'm really excited to talk about school transportation and access to education, which is really what school transportation is all about. And I started Hop Skip Drive about 11 years ago with two other women, and really it came from our own feelings of guilt as parents. We were really struggling getting our own kids to and from school and after school activities and all of the things as full-time working parents, and the school transportation system wasn't working for us. And so we created a solution that would solve our need as busy parents, and that has now grown into solving this huge need for school districts across the country.
Excellent. Okay, so please share your slides and tell us a bit more.
Sure. Um, okay, great. Let me move to. All right, can everyone see this?
Perfect. Thank you.
Excellent. So, as I was saying, school transportation is really about access to education. It is one of the most important transportation systems in our country. And I know there are a lot of people on here from places outside of the US, but this is going to be a little US focused, because it's really about enabling access to opportunity and to education. The school transportation system is the largest mass transit system in our country. And it's fascinating because it's one that often goes very underlooked and very under-discussed when we are talking about transit and transportation, because it really operates outside of the Department of Transportation, public mass transit. But there's almost 500,000 school buses on the road every single day. And so it is a massive system. And it's broken. It is expensive, it is inefficient, and it's really leaving our kids behind. The way that we route school buses today is really based on eligibility, not on utilization. As John mentioned earlier, 50 million kids are eligible for transportation because they live in those boundaries, but less than half of them are actually taking the bus to school. And the needs of our kids have really changed from when this system was initially designed. We have more kids who have really high mobility changes. These are kids who are experiencing homelessness, who move around frequently. They're very hard to route on a fixed route system. We have a lot of kids with special needs who aren't going to their home schools. We have a real push towards school choice and open enrollment and being able to attend the school that you want to go to. That again wreaks havoc on a fixed route school bus system where we are trying to get 50 million kids to school in a one size fits all 72 passenger bus. So it's very inefficient routing. Add to that massive bus driver shortages. We have seen driver shortages for over, a couple of decades, but really exacerbated by COVID when nearly half of our school bus drivers retired early. So today, over 90% of districts still report a moderate to severe bus driver shortage. So what's happening is schools are solving that problem by cutting service. John talked about kids who live more than 2 miles outside of school. We are seeing those walk boundaries increase. So districts are solving this problem by increasing walk boundaries, by consolidating routes, by pulling back on service, by eliminating service for high school students. And that is shifting the burden onto parents and onto personal vehicles to solve this problem. Now, this is causing not just transportation problems, but this is causing chronic absenteeism problems. We have a huge chronic absenteeism crisis in our country that has been made worse because of COVID. And there is obviously a direct correlation between access to transportation and attendance. If you don't have a way of getting to school, you're not going to school. And we see headlines like this one on Plano, where Plano changes the walk boundaries. Over 1,000 kids are now without service. So now we've shifted the burden to parents. And this is causing real economic issues. We do a state of school transportation report every year. I encourage all of you to go to our website and download it. This year, we interviewed both school administrators and parents. 11% of the parents we surveyed said they have lost a job because of their child's transportation needs. So this is causing massive problems, not just with our school administration and transportation teams and our transportation systems. This is causing massive problems for our families and for parents who are trying to solve this challenge. And that's where HopSkipDrive comes in. So we offer really two main ways of helping schools and families solve this problem. The first is we have our care-centered transportation marketplace where, John was mentioning this is really about the goal is to create a safe, clean, and equitable system. Our marketplace really focuses on the safe and the equitable. We supplement school buses. We are not replacing school buses, but we match school district demand to our network of highly vetted drivers that we call care drivers who are using their own personal vehicles and really turning community members into school transportation superheroes to help districts solve this problem, particularly for the populations that need it most. Students who are experiencing homelessness, who move around a lot, very hard to route on a bus. Students who have special needs who need to go to a special school. You don't need a full school bus to get them there. So by working with districts alongside the school bus, we can help the entire system achieve better utilization, better cost efficiency, and more importantly, get those kids to school when they need to get to school. Our RouteWise AI transportation intelligence helps districts look at the entire system. It's looking at all of their assets, buses, small vehicles, vans, looking at utilization and helping them come up with smarter planning decisions. We're able to give them scenario analysis that really helps them understand the impact of decision making and allows them to solve for the challenges that are most important to them, whether that is cutting cost, whether that is increasing the number of kids transported, reducing time in transit, or making the shift to cleaner models, how to do that in the most intelligent way. And I'll just share a couple of really quick case studies that give some examples. Here's two where our marketplace is really driving student outcomes. So Riverside County Office of Education had a particular alternative education program that they were sending mostly foster students to outside of, again, like your neighborhood school or going to your school. They were really struggling with attendance. When they started using HopSkipDrive and offering students a safe, stable, reliable ride, we saw attendance surge from 29% to 79% attendance rates. That's a massive difference. Detroit Public Schools, continuing severe driver shortages and a huge increase in their homeless population was also creating attendance challenges. Using HopSkipDrive helped them drive a 14% decrease in chronic absenteeism. So these are outcomes that are maybe not what you typically see with transportation in terms of utilization or cost, but these are what matter most in our education system. As we think about RouteWise, I want to point out a couple of case studies to give an example. As districts are making some of these decisions around their transportation systems, these decisions have massive impacts on their community. So there's been a huge push towards moving high school start times later. It's much better for high school students, gets them more sleep, but changing bell times has a severe impact on transportation logistics and has a huge impact on the community, right? You change school start times, that's a great way to get parents flooding board meetings, screaming about the impact of what that means. So, Ohio County, a school district in West Virginia, their board said, we're going to shift time to X and just made the decision. The transportation team used RouteWise to run hundreds of thousands of analyses and show the board, hey, the decision you're making is going to cost us $2 million. Here are 20 cost neutral alternatives that meet the intent, that change the bell times, but don't have an additional cost. And now here we can choose, now we can make a better decision, make a better decision for our district and a better decision for our community. And we're going to know the impact before it happens. D11 is another great case study. This is a school district in Colorado Springs. They had a 50% driver shortage. They had 100 routes and about 50 drivers. They were really challenged. It was a huge problem. We came in, RouteWise looked at that utilization. We took actually several bus stops and turned those into HopSkipDrive routes, not even consolidating routes, just changing the nature of those routes. And we helped them actually manage so that they now had 50 routes for 55 drivers and were solving the problem in a multimodal way. What that did was that saved a lot of money in OpEx. They chose to give that money back to bus drivers for a retention strategy. So they used that OpEx savings to increase driver pay. They were able to reduce their capital spend over the next 10 years by about 30+% because we showed that they didn't need as many buses as they thought they needed. And so as they move to replenish, they can replenish fewer. As they move to make a decision to move to electric, that's a decision that becomes more feasible because they need fewer buses. But more importantly, we help them increase on-time arrival rates across all of their vehicles by managing the routes much more efficiently. And we added back 17,000 academic hours by getting those kids to school on time. So those are just a few of the examples of how HopSkipDrive works with districts. We work in about 20 states. We have about 700 school districts that contract with us. And every day we're really excited about the ability to get kids access to opportunity and access to education and give our care drivers access to safe, reliable income opportunities.
Sorry, trying to unmute myself. Thank you so much, Joanna. Just a super quick follow-up question. Just in terms of can you paint us a picture of what the marketplace actually looks like? So you have these individuals that clearly you're carefully vetting the drivers if we are to entrust these individuals with our children. Do they typically pick up like 2 or 3 or 4 children or students and move them about? How does it actually, is it a one-to-one pickup? Tell us a little bit about the logistics of the operation.
Sure, sure. Well, and I'll start with the care drivers. We call them care drivers because they have to have caregiving experience as part of being on our platform, and they go through a 15-point certification process that includes fingerprint-based background checks and a whole host of other things. So they're very highly vetted, and we have built a lot of technology that really measures and improves safety throughout the platform. We contract directly with districts and work with them as they are looking to route students. Some of them do want one-to-one. Some of them want more bundling, and our technology will carpool and bundle students as needed. Districts are going to know that, Duncan and John just can't be in the same car together because they might end up in a fight on the way to school, and that's not a great way to show up ready to learn. And so in that case, we might have 2 separate cars. Yes. So we really work with our district partners to identify the right utilization of the vehicles.
Super. Okay. All right. Why don't we shift gears from the access question to the sustainability question? So, Duncan, I want to turn to you. You are the founder and CEO of Highland Electric Fleets, which is electrifying school bus fleets and now other business fleets as well. Obviously, we'll hear more about Highland, but just in terms of your background, you started your career as an analyst with Harris Williams and Company, later becoming an associate at Polaris Venture Partners. You went on to found Alternex, an energy and emissions management network, and then served as a managing partner before becoming senior vice president at Edison Energy LLC. You earned your bachelor's degree in finance from Babson College. So thank you, first of all, for joining us today. Tell us a bit about Highland Electric Fleets. And I'll just start with the same question that I started with Joanna, which is what motivated you to get into this business, to found this company?
Sure. John, thanks for having me. And Joanna, loved hearing from you again and getting reminded about all the great work you're doing. Right, I've spent my whole career sort of in various pockets of energy transition, clean tech, and ultimately have been inspired by how great our decarbonizing technologies are, but how tricky they are to commercialize and get to market. Uh, the Highland journey started for me in early 2018 when I realized that my son Angus, who was a second grader at the time, his mouth is at the same height as the tailpipe on a diesel school bus, and that's about how tall a second grader is. And if you stand there at the bus stop, you can smell it, but if you look at the data, you'll see that kids who live in really urban areas that have poor air quality have higher rates of pediatric asthma, higher rates of cancer in those communities. From a health standpoint, we know very clearly what local air quality can do to kids and people in general. That was an interesting time, 2018, in that EVs were really starting to take off. And if you got in an EV at that time, it's hard not to be inspired by just the simplicity and the beauty of the technology. Just very few moving parts. You convert a unit of energy into a unit of propulsion a lot more efficiently. There's clearly local health benefits. The fuel's cheaper, the maintenance on these vehicles is less significant. And if you look at it compared to a big diesel powertrain, the technologies are just worlds apart. And so I was very inspired by the promise of the tech. And when I started thinking about fleets more broadly, to me, it was obvious that you'd focus on shorter route-based fleets for the early days of EV evolution. And cities would want to focus on the youngest members of their population. And the school bus opportunity became really a light bulb because you can improve the day-to-day for drivers, for mechanics. You can improve air quality for kids and communities, and you can run these buses cheaper and more reliably over time. And the last thing you can do is you can balance your energy grid because you've got these energy dense battery packs that sit idle for about 90% of the hours in a year when they're not running kids to and from school. And so for me, it was a really obvious natural opportunity. There's a challenge, which is some of these industries are tricky to really drive adoption of new tech. It can be expensive. It can feel risky. There's all sorts of expertise needed to implement. And if you're going to do it affordably, you may need to integrate some grants. You may have opportunity to bring tax credits in. You have to find the right financing mechanisms to capitalize these projects and get them going. And all of those things, to me, were an obvious way to bundle and deliver an end result to a community. And as opposed to telling a community that they should do all this and it'll work out, much like the solar industry or the energy efficiency industry, there's tons of business models that have been developed to help accelerate the commercialization of the tech. we do the same thing for electrified fleets. So today we run electrified school buses, garbage trucks, a whole host of fleets that serve cities. And we're really focused on, the public sector, and we're focused on acting as a long-term partner. We call it electrification as a service. And instead of charging for vehicles and charging for infrastructure and charging for services, we bundle it all and we typically charge by the mile. So a school might get a fully fueled and fully maintained electrified school bus fleet at 5 in the morning every school day.
Interesting. So you don't actually, you're not, the districts don't actually own these electric school buses. You're owning the asset, or how does that
Yeah,
work?
let me share a slide or two if that's okay, John, and I can
Please.
answer that uh, a little deeper. Um, and let's see, is that coming through? Maybe not.
Yes.
Okay. Well, this is a depot. So if you think about it, this is the average school depot, and there's maybe a maintenance building, and there's some offices. Maybe there's a little training room, and this is a bigger one in Maryland. And they've got upwards of 400 buses, but they can range from 5 or 10 buses up to 400 or 500, depending on the size of the school. Um, the fact that it's new technology has typically made it uh, uh, a little trickier for people who are accustomed to a diesel powertrain to take a big bet. And it's a big capital bet, and there's obvious hesitancy around adopting new technology at scale without enough time to really test it and vet it. And so we'll actually capitalize everything. We'll take that off the table. If you can see in this lower string here, that's an electrified segment of the fleet. And you can see all those charging stations are lined up. There's power cabinets, there's a transformer. This is a site where we brought 5 megawatts of power in. And we run, I think, something like 75 electric school buses. We believe this whole fleet will transition over time. But to your question, for the school, it is often easier for someone else to capitalize all the assets, bring them all in a bundle, and then provide them a little bit like the solar industry provides equipment to a homeowner or a business, and provides a power purchase agreement. When the power shows up, we'll sell it to you at a 10% discount to the utility rate tariff. We try to do something pretty similar. And that way, when the chargers aren't working or the vehicles aren't working, there there's no pointing fingers, but there's really one partner responsible for making it all work. And that's a tricky set of services to integrate. And in the early days of this market, it is definitely there's been a learning curve for everyone on getting it to work perfectly. But the equipment's getting better and better. And it's reliable enough today where we can, reliably set up fleets. We can run them in conjunction with cities, and we can do things like power the Olympics in LA in 2028, where we'll run 500 electric buses. It's the largest global sporting event, and so proving the technology works at scale, something that we're really excited to do, and we're ramping up in a number of geographies to do stuff like this. Um,
Fabulous. So
yeah,
you're delivering a kind of turnkey solution, which I would imagine takes out quite a bit of the risk among the decision makers, the fleet managers who are responsible for school transportation. What are some of the kind of concerns that they might express as to, oh, we don't want to do this because of what?
yeah. I think the concerns tend to be maybe three or four key buckets. The first is cost, and so what we're asking a school to do or a city to do is buy transportation in a little bit of a different way. They tend to have a capital budget where they buy new vehicles and they buy equipment, and then they have an operating budget, which tends to be separate. We're advocating that they think of those fungibly and think about the model a little bit different. And then within that, there's the actual dollars and cents. Here's the budget we have for the year, and here's the budget we have for next year, and here are the risks around appropriation of funds in future years. And so navigating cost is typically the first hurdle that we've got to go through. And as Joanna knows, schools have limited budgets, and transportation tends to be secondary to curriculum and school buildings and other things like that. So navigating the budget is one key obstacle. A second one is implementation. There's always a hesitancy around running a project like this, and navigating everything from procurement to perceived technology risks to training. Joanna mentioned school bus driver shortages. She's spot on. I mean, I live here in Boston, as folks at MIT probably know. Coming out of COVID, I think the National Guard was brought in to drive school buses in Boston because they were short so many drivers. That story resonates with virtually every city transportation operator across the country. No one has a surplus of drivers. And so there's hesitancy around new technology because the older drivers, any driver who's comfortable and is comfortable with their equipment, is often hesitant to adopt new technology. Now, we have overcome that as an industry by with lots of testimonials and lots of drivers who might have spent 30 years in a diesel bus, and they get in an electric and they say, I'm never giving this bus back. I love it. It's quiet. The kids don't yell at me. It's smooth. I can 1 foot drive because regenerative braking is so enjoyable. It's really an upgraded experience, but change is hard for anyone. And it's really about myth busting, educating, and creating a cadence of bringing people along and getting them comfortable. And then I would say that the last piece is just technology interoperability. How long will my batteries last? Will they marry up with the charger? What happens if I plug it in and it doesn't work? Right? There's the unknown that I would just put in the bucket of technology unknown. And so, John, we try to take all of those concerns off the table by delivering a performance-based integrated service. And that works very well in lots of places, which is why we're running in 100 cities today across the country and growing, very quickly. But having said that, there are many operators who really like doing pieces of that on their own, and then we're sort of bifurcating the offering, and we're providing just financing, or we're providing some level of services. And so I think the bottom line is folks who try it at a small pilot scale often see the challenges across all three of those areas, and they're hesitant to go for half of their fleet. But when you have a partner who can integrate and provide technology backbones and training and services, it tends to help drive adoption.
Sure, sure. And I want to bring Joanna in as well, but it just super quick. Where do these electric vehicles come from? I mean, we've heard about we do a lot of work with public transportation agencies, and they have been very clear about the driver shortage problem. And by the way, not just in the United States, but in Japan, in a number of different countries around the world, this is a very real and pressing issue. Where do the electric buses actually come from, Duncan?
Yeah, all the product that we operate today is made in America. We're buying, traditional incumbent bus and truck manufacturer product. We buy from Daimler They own a school bus maker called Thomas Built, and they build the chassis in South Carolina. They built the buses in North Carolina. We buy from IC, and they build in Oklahoma. We buy from Bluebird. They build in Georgia. The supply chain, the automotive supply chain is inherently global today. There are things we don't make here in the US that are a function of a global supply chain. And but the core manufacturing operations are all happening here. And I think that that model's being questioned and challenged in lots of arenas, including the political arena. And so we're trying to stay really close to that. But I'm a firm believer that we need to have domestic manufacturing, because when you get into the world of more modern technology, you can't just have the IP on paper. You have to iterate and tinker at the manufacturing level to get the equipment to work really, really well. So the IP and the process of building it end up going hand in hand. So we're big advocates of supporting all our domestic manufacturers and helping them continue to get to scale.
And I want to bring in Jinhua as well to see if he has any reactions. But just before that, so Joanna, what is it that sort of Duncan said that may have resonated with you in terms of like, I mean, you're both trying to change a system. And what do you find is the real challenges there to get this system changed?
Yeah. A lot of what Duncan said resonated, but I think really and particularly talking about how schools are sometimes just they're very hesitant to adopt change. And they're very hesitant to adopt things that look different than what it looked like before. Even though we've seen massive disruption to education and to the way school districts operate over the last 5 years, it just the willingness to recognize that and try to adopt to innovate is very challenging across the board. And so it is hard to try to disrupt in a space that doesn't necessarily know that it wants to be disrupted.
So I suppose the best thing you can do is find some, great cases, some success stories like what you shared and say, look, I mean, this is a different system, but it's working.
Yeah.
That's
And
right.
but I also think, Joanna, you hit on the value of your offering, but I also we see traffic in basically every school drop off except really rural areas. And the traffic is bad because the 50% of kids that used to walk or ride their
Mhm.
bikes, they don't anymore. And they're inside of 2 miles, so their parents just drive them and drop them off. That disrupts, productivity in the workplace. It adds more congestion to the communities. And so finding a more dynamic, more technology driven, more integrated model to solve for that, feels to me like it's all of what this MIT Mobility Forum is seeking to sort of solve for. I grew up 1.9 miles from my school, and I remember having to ride my bike, and it was cold some days, and it was snowing, and I was really upset about that. And so I think the reality is, if my parents were willing to drive me, I would have solved it that way. But this is a better way to do it, is more technology, cleaner vehicles, and yeah, and a better managed system.
That's right. And I think when you add multimodal to that, then you can do a lot of things like hub and spoke. So, and that's a lot of what we do with districts sometimes is bringing kids to a central location to fill that bus up. And so you could see even bringing kids from that 1.8 or 1.9 mile radius to the 2.0 mile radius, having them all get on one stop and get those
Mm.
kids to school. And now you've got a very full school bus. You've got a very efficient route. You're cutting down on some of those the congestion at pickup and drop off. But the answer is not adding another bus. The answer is really thinking multimodally. Buses,
Yeah.
small vehicles, vans, bikes, walking. It's like, how do you look at the whole system holistically to create the
Yeah.
most efficient and cost effective and safe solution?
Oh, that's very interesting. A wonderful concept, because then you're solving for that issue of congestion right around the school district, which Duncan was talking about. Um, Jinwa, do you have any sort of reflections or reactions to what we've heard?
Sure. Yeah. No, I mean, I just want to share a story. At my team, my department, there's a staff member. Uh, she lives in Springfield, Massachusetts. Duncan, you're probably familiar on that, right? She told me that her child's peer, often they couldn't afford a car. Public transit is not sufficient. And their school bus, as you, Joanna, Duncan mentioned, lack of buses, lack of drivers. And as a result, many students just do not go to school. And when kids don't go to school, they do other things, often not good things. So the societal cost for kids not to school is way much higher than the cost of providing public transit or public transportation or school transportation there, right? I really hope that societal wise, we should make the calculation clear and change the dynamic. I really appreciate Joanna and Duncan. You are the leader re-innovating and offer price specific solution to that. Actually, concretely, Lorena, the staff member, reached out to me saying, "Oh, can you help? You guys doing transportation?" We try to offer some analytics, try to improve the thing. But today, I know the solution. I should point her to Joanna and Duncan, so you can help provide much more systematic support to them. But thank you for offering today's talk.
Thank you. No, we have story after story after story of kids whose, lack of transportation means they're not accessing opportunities. They're not getting to school. And for a lot, I talk about homeless students and students with special needs. These are very big populations. There's 1.3 million homeless students in the US. There's 400,000 kids in foster care. School might be their one source of stability, as everything else in their lives is unstable. If they don't have a way to get to school, they're not going to school, they're missing out on, if it takes 2 weeks to route a school bus for a child, who, by the way, once you route it, they may have moved again, that's 2 weeks of algebra that they've missed. They're not
Well,
going to catch up.
it's also where they sometimes get breakfast and lunch.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's where they
Yeah.
eat. It's where they see their friends. Sometimes it's where they see their siblings. It is high, we have to solve this problem for them, and we have to think about solving it equitably. Sometimes schools' option is, well, just give them a bus pass, a metro bus pass. And what we have found is that what that might mean is 2 hours on a public bus and trains with multiple transfers through unsafe neighborhoods. Yes, that child can get to school, but is that really equitable to other kids who are taking a 20-minute school bus to get to school? And that means they can't stay after for extracurricular activities. They can't stay after for tutoring. So they're missing out even more. So we have to think about the equity of the transportation systems as well.
Right. I have another technical question. The same staff member also mentioned to me the following, because the school district required the parents to register their kids for school bus through some online portal, etc. Right. For many parents, for either language reason or not familiar with the technology, they register student very late, often like 1 month or 1.5 months late. Often being told that, sorry, we did our algorithm, we don't know how to handle this, right? So Joanna, if you can provide the solution saying that we can quickly respond to those student requests, that will, in the technical level, help a lot. Yes.
Absolutely. The more outreach districts can do upfront to understand enrollment, eligibility, and and interest in train. Just because you're eligible for transportation doesn't mean you want to use it, right? Some kids do want to bike or use other means of transport, but if we can understand that up front, we can design the routes in the most efficient ways and pick the right vehicle and the right route for each student to create the most efficient system. But by the way, that changes throughout the year as kids are identified as home, as kids move, as new kids are identified as homeless, as programs change. And so it needs to be an ongoing process. That's what things like RouteWise can really help districts with. But schools could do a much better job of outreach to try to solve, to get more information and data when they're doing their route planning.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Another quick comment to Duncan, your point. I really like that because the school bus, if you look at it, it has been who look like that, operate like for decades. There's no progress on that. We want to expose our kids with the modern technology on this. I think the fact you are electrifying that, it may be potentially even better design for the children to recognize there are very great sustainable mobility technology out there. From early on, expose that and promote that. That's another aspect I like.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think electrification of transportation is the most significant sort of technology transition that will happen over a 50-year period of time. And the reality is kids who get inspired by that get really excited to think more about science, technology, and math. And kids who get on these buses write us letters all the time as to how cool it is. And it made them want to look under the hood and actually think about the technology side of things. The problems that Joanna is describing, they're all spot on, and we've been trying to solve them with policy for a long time. And we have done some good work as a society in being like better than we used to be about getting homeless kids to school and providing, more required routes that ensure kids get educated and get fed if their parents can't do that. But I think we're at a point where it's really tricky to make a lot of incremental progress with policy. And we're also living in a world where the school budgets are being challenged more and more. There's less federal funding, and there's more scrutiny at the local level because of healthcare costs and insurance costs and wages increasing faster than inflation. And so we've got tough dynamics around school budgets almost everywhere. So I don't expect that policy on its own is going to drive solutions. We have to drive solutions by innovating and bringing new technology that is cleaner, cheaper, and more reliable and better so that it's multimodal. And by the way, bike lanes can be part of that. I love riding my bike unless it's snowing in Boston. And then I really don't like riding my bike. And so creating a multimodal system that's efficient, dynamic, and clean and reliable and equitable, that's what we're talking about here. But it's got to be solved with more people doing the work on electrification or on, ride share, and having those businesses come together, not by driving our policymakers. Policymakers can help. And I saw in the chat, Scott Rodman referenced something near and dear to us, which is basically limiting, the taxes and excise taxes on EVs and stuff like that helps. And it's huge. And you've got to do it at a local level. But innovation will solve the day. Long run, not policy. I'm convinced.
I could not agree more. I mean, we need policy to be more open-minded to innovation and to technology, but you need the innovation to happen as well.
Super.
And if you think about it, getting to school, the vehicle you're in, whether it's a school bus or a car, like that's the start of your school day. And so I love that like students are writing letters to they're learning even as they are getting onto that electric bus or they are getting into a sedan that is an EV sedan. Like that is the start of their school day. And we should be taking that into account because that's what sets them up for success for the rest of the school day.
Super. Okay. Very active chat. Let's turn it over to Bhuvan to share some of the questions.
Thanks, John. I just dropped in the link, some trivia about the school bus requirements. This actually came into force in 1939 when a researcher from Columbia, Frank Cirque, came up with a set of requirements for school buses. And now we know that the National Congress for School Transportation oversees these requirements. So for folks who are interested, there's a link in the chat regarding that. Okay, coming to the question, let me start with you, Joanna. So a lot of questions about, you mentioned this whole care-centered marketplace. Questions around, are drivers using their personal cars or is the fleet provided by HopSkipDrive? Are these care drivers employees or contractors? How are they monitored? Do the vehicles have like GPS? Is it connected? Are they able to communicate with the parents or students in case of delays or emergencies? And does HopSkipDrive contract with the district or with the parents, and who pays for this? So it's the whole business
Yes.
model and how it
I
works.
love all these questions. So we contract directly with the school districts. The school districts are contracting with us, and the directors of transportation, much like they are routing kids onto school buses, they and their staff are routing kids onto HopSkipDrive vehicles. We designed this whole thing with safety in our DNA. I mean, the question that we designed the whole system around was, what would it take for me to put Jackson or Sam in a HopSkipDrive? And so that starts with care drivers. Care drivers are independent contractors. They are using their own personal vehicles. And so it is similar in that we are licensed the same way as Uber and Lyft, but it is completely different from that point on. The license is the same, everything else is different. Drivers go through a 15-point certification process. They are fingerprinted. They have to have caregiving experience. We do a skills-based screening to understand that experience. We do vehicle inspections. We do education on neurodivergence. We do training on how to work with kids with neurodivergence or trauma-informed care. And so these are nannies, former teachers, people who are taking care of their grandkids and then driving for HopSkipDrive in and around that. They're people who really, we like to say they come for the money, but they stay for the mission. They are deeply invested in this idea of helping kids. They're often driving in the same districts where their own kids went to school. And so they really see it as an opportunity to give back. There is a whole system of technology that is built into these rides, making sure they are safe. We call it our Safe Ride technology. And that includes, we have a Safe Ride support team that is monitoring every ride live in real time and responding to proactive proprietary alerts that we have built, telling us what is going on in the ride. There's GPS, there's telematics. We are the only ones in the industry. I'm very proud of this. We call it our proactive detection. We can detect how a driver is driving on the way to pickup. Are they speeding? Are they swerving? Do they seem like they might be impaired or just not driving safely today? We can actually make that determination and prevent a child from getting in that car before the ride even starts. So
Is
we
this via
really
like an
believe.
OBD device that they have to install
No,
in
it's all
their
through the
car?
app. It's all through the phone.
Oh,
It's
it's all
all
through
through
the
the
phone.
phone
Okay.
and the
Great.
accelerometer and what we've built into the app. I believe I'm very passionate about safety, and I'm very passionate about using data to measure and improve safety. So I don't believe in some of the checklists of, did this did this driver do their medical exam? Did they do this? Did they do this? Check, check, check. That doesn't actually measurably increase safety during the ride. And so we've built a whole system of that. School districts can see everything. Parents have full transparency. They have the app, they can download it, see where their child is, get alerts along the way. And our team is monitoring everything as well.
All right. Thanks. That was great. Duncan, moving on to you. So I think a couple of questions on I think the business model on Highland engaging on vehicle to grid opportunities. You mentioned this fact about that 90% of the school bus hours in a year it lies idle. So maybe if you could add some of on that, and also if you shared the photo of the LA Olympics. So on that, could school buses could they be used for transportation when not used for transporting others, when not used to transport children as well? So the multi-business opportunities in the school bus sector.
Yeah, yeah, really good questions. So uh, let's start with vehicle to grid. So I think of myself as kind of an energy nerd before I got into transportation. And so I found the opportunity to use a battery for two things to be fascinating. If you could use it to move a vehicle, and then when it's sitting idle, you could use it to help provide storage for the grid. And effectively double up the use case and do it in an elegant way, you could drive down the cost of both things at the same time. And so as a result, in 2018, I wrote a business plan for Highland, and half of the pages were about vehicle to grid. What I didn't realize at the time was how difficult it was to build a transportation business first. And we've done that. But I'm happy to say for the last 4 years, we've been backflowing power from school bus fleets throughout Massachusetts, Vermont, Maryland, and a growing number of states to shift the peak within the markets. And we're largely doing that at the distribution level. And so a good example would be here in Massachusetts, National Grid pays under what is effectively a demand response program, but batteries can participate for shifting the peak in the summer, in the evenings when our solar production ramps down and everyone's AC production demand is ramped up. And so there are programs that we've designed in conjunction with utilities, and there are other programs that we've just participated in. So Green Mountain Power up in Vermont, who I'm very fond of. They've been an awesome partner. Our buses up there are integrated into the control room, so they can dispatch our batteries after, I think after 4 o'clock. They can see how much is available, and then they can dispatch them to help offset peak usage every month year round. And it's examples like that where we can create some supplemental income. And ultimately, that allows us to offer electrified transportation cheaper. Schools don't know enough about that yet, typically, to really want to bet on it. But if we're willing to lower our per mile rate in order to activate those programs, they're usually very keen to let us do that. So I still think we're in the early days of building out a really durable vehicle to grid market. But the places where we've done it successfully, we find it works really well for us, and utilities are still trying to quantify the value. But I'm optimistic that we're on the right track to do that really well. Your second question, the short answer is yes. School buses can be used when they're idle for other things. This is where you get into sort of local regulations. And there are a lot of cities that want to own buses or have buses that are dedicated to them that are not used for anything else in terms of driving. But about a third of the market is owned and operated by private contractors. And they tend to use the buses for weddings and field trips. And, they'll sign contracts with private schools to do athletic runs and stuff like that. So supplemental income is available in the traditional transportation mode, but I don't know that that's an area where there's anything innovative happening right now. That's kind of always been part of the market. It still will be part of the market, but we don't get super involved in that. We focus on getting the EVs out there, getting them running smoothly and affordably, and then running battery storage where we can.
And are these drivers the drivers who are already running the diesel school buses who then shift to electric, or do you all get your own drivers in along with your whole solution?
It's the same drivers. So a city will partner with Highland and we'll train the city's drivers on how to operate the vehicles. And we'll also train the city's mechanics on how to work on them if they want to. And so when they need repairs, we'll let them do that, and then we'll reimburse the city for the time that it takes based on an hourly sort of rate schedule.
I think we're at time. So.
Right. Yeah. So we're at time now. First of all, thank John for designing the panel together. And for Duncan and Joanna, we know that entrepreneurship is never easy. And to really make a meaningful contribution and of a business in this school transportation, even harder. But this is the mission. I'm really proud of you. And all of us should thank you for your effort really pushing this innovation on the ground. And all the kids and educators will really appreciate this. Everyone, please join me. Thank Duncan and Joanna for today's presentation.